want to begin a YouTube video in such a way, in such a confrontational way. Surely I must be aware that you clicked on this video on the promise of the thumbnail and the title. What is really missing from modern music? That's what you want to know. And you want me to tell you in the first few minutes of this video. Perhaps you want me to agree with your thoughts, to support your view of the world. A few seconds, a few minutes where your jaded worldview can get some recognition outside the narrow confines of your local experience. A justification for your existence. But I'm not playing the game. I'm acting in a way that you and I know I shouldn't act. My manner is too aggressive. My look full of disdain. My speech is stilted and seems to have no point. Some of you may say, "Oh, Andy's being weird today. Look, he's being weird." But why am I being weird? Why would I choose to do this? Can't I just do what's expected? Can't I just come on here and push your buttons and get you to look in? Tell you that modern music is terrible. Say it's all down to the kids not knowing about anything. The fact that all the singers are auto-tuned and all the drummers are quantized. That the songs are too simple. That nobody knows anything about music theory anymore. That the attention span is too short. And so everything is reduced down to the level of a nursery rhyme. But a dirty nursery rhyme. The morals have descended, where all you have to do is get a hit record. To get a hit record, it's just to get your big bottom out. Oh, I said bottom. That's just ruined. That's ruined this, hasn't it? Oh, why don't you get your big bottom out, Andy, then, if that's the case? Oh, well, I don't think I have the right sort of bottom for modern culture. Anyway, I've got to get back into the more serious Andy. So, come on. I want to disrupt. I want to challenge. I want to exemplify something that is not the norm. And I want to inflict that on the world around me. I want to be seen as different, perhaps rebellious. I want to stand out from the crowd. I want to hold my freak flag high. I want to be seen as the romantic ideal of the windswept and interesting outsider. I don't see myself as being the same as anybody else or everybody else. Everybody out there I call normal people. Are you a normal person? When I talk about the normal people, Do you feel a part of that group? Do you feel a part of this world? If the answer is yes, you need to switch this video off now, because you will not understand any of it. But if your answer is no, and you don't feel a part of this world, that is what I'm going to talk about today. And my thesis throughout will be that what is missing from modern music is the idea of the outsider. So, 35 years ago, I went up to see a girl I was seeing in Wolverhampton, and I drove up there. I'd listened to music all my life. I got heavily interested in music at around about 12 years old, interested in heavy metal that turned into sort of classic rock bands, that turned into progressive rock bands, that turned into jazz rock bands, and eventually avant-garde and modern jazz. I like music that nobody else liked, and that was my badge of honour. So with that in mind, you have to put yourself in to the shoes, if you can, of me at 20 years old driving up to Wolverhampton in my car. Now, it would be nice for me to portray myself with the romantic ideal of the wide-eyed loner on my way alone in my car up to Wolverhampton, but it wasn't quite like that. When I was 15 years old, I'd had a nervous breakdown. I'd had such severe anxiety for a long time I couldn't leave the house. The symptoms were so serious that the doctors seriously thought I had something wrong with me and started to run all sorts of blood tests and body scans to see what the hell was happening. But what was happening is I'd lost my grip on reality, and extreme anxiety had taken over me. I was in a desperate situation at 15 years old, having no way to really negotiate through this thing that had come along and completely ruined my life. I wasn't able to go to school. For a certain period, I wasn't able to go out the house. But here I was at 20, driving a car on my own up to Wolverhampton. I can remember the drive up because this journey changed my life. When I arrived in Wolverhampton, it was a normal evening. I saw the girl I was seeing at the time, saw her friends. I stopped over there, and when I woke up the next day to go back home, anxious about having to drive the car home, but more anxious about not being at home, because my anxiety acted like an elastic band attached to my bedroom. By this point, I'd been able to leave the house, but to leave the house required me pressing against this great big elastic band that was trying to pull me back in to my perceived safety. So I was horrified to wake up the next day and go out to my car and see that overnight there had been a huge snowstorm and the roads were packed deep with crisp, new, white snow. Now, snow, as we know, is one of those examples of the magical transformation that nature can achieve when she wants. So I stood out there in the cold, looking at my car, realising that I wouldn't be able to return home, and that a magical transformation had occurred. The world had been changed overnight, and in every aspect it looked clean and new. My girlfriend at the time, she left and went to work, so I was stuck in the house all day. I managed to find a pair of Wellingtons, and I decided to walk on into the town of Wolverhampton. I crunched my way through the snow with not much money in my pocket, because I was very poor back then, and I eventually found myself in a second-hand bookshop. In that bookshop, I found this book, dusty and old, Back then it actually had the jacket on it. I've since lost that. But that title piqued my interest. So I bought the book. I crunched my way back home, and I felt now, without the internet or television, because that wasn't there, that I would have a book to keep me company, and I could read it until the snow dissipated, or at least dissipated enough that I could drive back home. When I got in, I opened up this book and I read this passage in the front. It's taken from a play by George Bernard Shaw called John Bull's Other Island, and it was from Act 4. And it was a conversation between two characters that back then I didn't know who they were, and I still don't know who they are now. One was called Broadbent and one was called Keegan. Broadbent. I find the world quite a good enough for me. I think it's a rather jolly place, in fact. And Keegan answered, looking at him in quiet wonder. Well, you're satisfied? Broadbent. As a reasonable man, yes. I see no evils in the world, except, of course, natural evils that cannot be remedied by freedom, self-government and English institutions. I think so, not because I am an Englishman, but as a matter of common sense. And Keegan said, you feel at home in the world then? And Broadbent went, of course. Don't you? Keegan, from the very depths of his nature, answered no. And with that, I suddenly realised that there were other people who saw the world like me. One such person is the young man seated behind me, leaning up against a tree in a sleeping bag, ensconced in a good book. That is in fact Colin Wilson, the writer of this, The Outsider, which came out, I believe, in around about 1956. Let's see if we can find out, because this is a first edition. I have 1957. The first edition, I had got myself a copy of the first edition of The Outsider. I found this book fascinating, and as I went through it, not only did it personify a way I felt about the world, but it also talked about all sorts of different characters that I'd never heard of. Nietzsche, Gurdjieff, I'm flicking through it now, William James, Nijinsky, T.E. Lawrence. What brought all these people together? Because that's what this book is. It's a description of a series of people, all bound by one thing, and that is that they were outsiders. Some of them were spiritual people. Some of them are artists. Some of them are criminals. Colin Wilson seemed to find a thread that would link the character of a T.E. Lawrence to a Charles Manson. I was absorbed in this book, and it was an astonishing thing because I felt like I knew nothing of the world that was being described in this book. This book led me to not only buy lots and lots of Colin Wilson, who had an interest in crime and an interest in the occult, two things I became very, very interested in. Crime, according to Colin Wilson, was like the examination of anti-creativity. That there was a will to make the world change. And you could go at that in two ways. You could go the way that was worthy, the creative way, or you could go the way of a cheat. A cheat that looks at the world and knows the rules, but says, I'm not going to follow those rules. In this book, Colin Wilson examined this idea of the outsider, and the way the outsider operates by applying Maslow's hierarchy of needs, something I'd never heard about. But Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a pyramid. It's a pyramid that we want to ascend. We start on the first rung of this ladder, just wanting to stay alive, to make sure we don't get killed, that we've got food, maybe clothes, that we're warm. And when we're in that state, that's all we care about. We don't care about anything else. Higher values don't matter to us. In that state, if you look at the artist will make art about food, about being warm, about being safe. And the criminal who is in that state, their crimes will be to get food, to get warmth, to get comfort. But as you rise up through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, once you achieve one, you naturally move to the next, which would be to have some sort of dwelling, a house or a home. Once that's achieved, then you might need to have a sexual partner, someone you can settle down with, have kids. Many people get stuck there. They can't find that partner. And at that point, everything about their being becomes about that. If they're an artist, their art, again, will dictate that. It will be dictated by that idea. It will be about the search for the opposite. And that has been, in popular music, a very big theme. But the criminal may go searching that by just ignoring the rules. These are the rapists, the sexual abusers. Once someone's achieved that, the next thing they will want to do is get the respect from their fellow man. Again, if we look at a lot of rock and popular music, we see that there's a big aspect, an almost overwhelming aspect, where people want to achieve some success in the music industry because that is precisely what they will get, the respect of the world around them. But a criminal could get other respect. They can get respect by terrorising their neighbourhood, through extortion, through violence. People like the Cray twins exerted a huge respect amongst the community, who would often apologise for them and justify their existence. Once you achieve respect, there's only one place you can then go. And it was a mysterious thing called self-actualization. Now, I'm not going to explain what self-actualization means here, partly because I'm not too sure even now that I understand what it is. But back then, 35 years ago, it seemed to me this guy was talking about being an outsider, and I felt like an outsider, and he described the state of being an outsider and the ascendancy through the ladder, and I was able to self-examine myself and almost position myself on the ladder and see where I was at. It seemed quite obvious to me that the remedy for my extreme anxiety was to be able to self-actualize. And perhaps the way I would self-actualize would to forego the normal route in life of settling down and having kids, of getting a house and a mortgage and a job and going on holiday for 2 weeks. I decided I wasn't going to go through that path. Precarious as though it would be, and more precarious to me, who had extreme anxiety, it was a strange choice to make. But perhaps then I believed that I could self-actualize by playing music, by being on stage, which I tried to do, but it didn't help. So maybe I needed to be more successful. Maybe I needed to play on bigger stages. And eventually, because that was my intention, that's what happened. By the age of 30, just a mere, say, 10 years later, I was sat on stage with Robert Plant, the lead singer of my favourite band when I was a young man, in front of 60,000 people, screaming and shouting. Did I feel now self-actualized? No. And when that band stopped, even though it held back my anxiety to a certain extent, Once the realization that that sort of that wasn't self-actualization, realized that that didn't help, my world came crashing down. One of the characters that most fascinated me in this book was the character of the Georgian mystic Gurdjieff. I searched books out on him. He had a path to self-actualization that seemed a lot more esoteric. I'd learnt about the esoteric, and I linked esotericness to outsiderness. Gurdjieff's method was based upon the idea of the I, of the self. To self-actualize, you need to consolidate your eyes. We were made up of all sorts of different personalities. In different situations with different people, we would have different viewpoints, different opinions. We were flim-flam. We were light and fluffy. There wasn't an actual person there. And then when you looked into the eyes of different people around you, you could see that they were asleep. They were going through the motions. All those people who had those jobs, who were paying those mortgages, they were trapped in the eternal cycle and they'd switched off. Every now and then, their little unconscious self would open its eyes, rub them and look around. This would often be jolted by an event that happened in the real world. They themselves couldn't do this, but a jolt may make them suddenly self-remember. And that was the feeling of going, I can't believe I'm actually here doing this right now. At that moment, it was a brief glimpse of consciousness. Our goal in life was to try and consolidate that. I realised perhaps that in my search to try and self-actualize through rock and roll, what had really happened was there were so many moments where I said to myself, I cannot believe I'm doing this, because those moments were so different from the normal treadmill of life that had ground me down and caused me to have a breakdown at the age of 15. How do you consolidate yourself to become conscious? How do you consolidate yourself to become conscious? You have to create shocks. Those shocks come from outside. You have to understand the randomness of the world, and you have to walk in step with it. So you start to get some sort of control. You have to strengthen yourself. You have to push yourself into a state of self-remembering. Now, why am I talking about all this on a video like this? I'm wasting your time. I'm a music YouTuber. I'm not a mystic. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a philosopher. You're probably thinking, I don't know, Andy, can't you just go on about Van de Graaff Generator's best and worst albums? Can't you make us have a laugh? You know, say, so why are you coming on and doing all this for? Why would you do it? Perhaps it's because I would like my videos every now and then to act as one of those shocks. 99% of the people who watch this video, perhaps they will just watch it and think, oh, well, I don't know, that bloke's a bit weird. But what about the 1%? I think about this all the time. And usually when I've spent a lot of time trying to get videos that get lots of views, I then will do something like this, which is far more esoteric. I've drawn you here with a clickbaity title, and I feel that I should now explain what I think is missing from music. In the early 20th century, characters like Gurdjieff were not the only people talking about this sort of consolidated I, or self-remembering, or being in the now, or feeling like a Superman. All these ideas go back to a certain philosopher perhaps, who was mentioned in this book, first time I've ever read about him, Nietzsche. Nietzsche turned away from that sort of Judeo-Christian view of the world, where human beings are seen as wretched, are full of sin, that need forgiveness, and almost the embodiment of self-loathing. Self-loathing being the thing that was driving my anxiety, that was driving my depression. Self-loathing. How many of you have got self-loathing? That is the machine. And Christianity was full of it. We were lowly, we were nothing. And the way to salvation was to believe in Jesus Christ. I didn't believe that at all back then. I had no interest in that type of thing. The rock and roll bands that I liked seemed to represent the opposite of that. Robert Johnson had sold his soul to the devil. Black Sabbath sung about demons. There seemed to be another thing out there that was much more countercultural. Rock and roll was the devil's music. Jerry Lee Lewis had tortured himself because he believed he was singing the devil's music. There was something about this rock and roll that was hard to put into words. And at a young age, I felt that that was my salvation. It was in effect Nietzschean. It was the man standing up, shedding his clothes, and outstretching his arm to the world and saying, "This is me. I'm here. Take it or leave it. I am a Superman." When I saw that in the rock bands that I loved, it chimed with me. Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, Frank Zappa. All of them stood before their audience like kings, a will to power. But they didn't conform to the world around them. They were the thorn in the side of the world around them, but they had control over the world around them. This idea of the rock and roll lifestyle, sex, drugs and rock and roll. Led Zeppelin and their entourage could travel across America, laying waste to everything that laid in their path. Taking every drug, having sex with every woman, smashing up every hotel room. They were outsiders. They were just normal working class kids. Well, in John Bonham's case, and I suppose to some extent Robert Plant's. But to me, I could see myself there. All I needed to do to enter that hallowed club was to practice my drums, to woodshed. And then, if I was to do that, I would be rewarded with a similar fate. The idea of being able to walk into a hotel with samurai swords and just absolutely trash the whole floor. And then walk down and hand over the money for the hotel to go and solve all the damage that you had done. It upturns what seems right or wrong. The hotels would rub their hands together knowing that they were about to get a whole floor refurbished. At one point in Led Zeppelin's history, when they went down to the hotel lobby and they handed over the £100,000 in cash to get the rooms repaired that they'd smashed up, the hotel manager looked at these guys. He was a normal person, a regular guy, a normal. And he turned around and said, "You think it's brilliant that you can do that, but we're just the normal people. We can't act like this." And the Led Zeppelin guys turned around and said, "Go on, have a room on us." They handed him the samurai sword and he dutifully marched upstairs, and as the good conformist that he was, he destroyed a hotel room. His action being, in fact, the complete opposite of what Led Zeppelin were doing. These stories, this counterculturalness, the stuff that my mum and dad didn't like, was what drew me to this. I was very interested in music. I talk about music a lot on this channel, how hard it is to make, the genius of it, the brilliance of it. But really, that was not what attracted me in the first place. The first band I was really drawn to that blew me away was Motorhead. Motorhead seemed like outsiders to me. Motorhead seemed like Marlon Brando in The Wild One, a film that came out in the late 40s, probably the beginning of rock and roll. Rock and roll's beginning is not a musical beginning. It's actually in film. And when Marlon Brando and his gang drives into that town, they're the bad guys. But suddenly the bad guys are always also the good guys. It captured a certain thing that was happening in the world at that moment, as people who had been born in the war years start to reach maturity, and they start to look at this awful cycle, this treadmill that they will have to drop on and conform to until they drop down dead, and they rejected it. But the seeds were there in the late 40s. It begins with Marlon Brando, it begins with James Dean, it begins with films like Rebel Without a Cause or Blackboard Jungle. And in Blackboard Jungle, you had Bill Haley and the Comets. And the kids got so rolled up by that film, by the story, that when they saw Bill Haley, who at that point was actually a very uncool middle-aged guy. He wasn't a teenager at all, with his awful kiss girl on his forehead. But when they saw that, they started to tear up the cinemas. Something was born. And these kids that were grown up watching Hollywood films, their access to rock and roll was through the films. Later on, we had a film that was almost cartoonish, A Girl Can't Help It, directed by Frank Tashlin, who had also directed many of the Bob Hope films, things like Road to Barley and Paleface, and had almost like personified the cartoons of Warner Brothers, Droopy the dog, Sylvester the cat. He managed to put that on film, and he populated it with larger-than-life characters. Who can forget Jane Mansfield walking down the road, grabbing those 2 milk bottles and melting ice? When I watched that as a young kid, it was Eddie Cochran that blew me away. It was just raw abandon. I was drawn to that. I was drawn to it. I've been brought up by my dad, who was into jazz, serious music. I wanted to be able to have music that was equal to jazz, but had this heaviness. Now, heaviness, which I think is a really important aspect to 20th century popular music, was the goal that we were all searching for. How many of you now, in your middle-aged years, when you look back at what you were trying to find when you started to go through all those albums in the record, I mean, what you were going through, what were you trying to find? Some intellectual description of who you were? Some display of virtuosity? I bet what you were looking for was a particular kind of heaviness. I was drawn to this heaviness. I first heard it in Motorhead and AC/DC and Iron Maiden. And then I heard more of it in Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. It was subtler but heavier. And then when I started to hear bands like King Crimson and the Mavish Orchestra, I found that was even more heavier than that. Then albums like Bitches Brew, albums like John Coltrane. My search for heaviness took me there. But I'm offering to you on this video, and this is my thesis here, that what is missing from music is heaviness. I don't mean loudness, I don't mean distorted guitars. I mean a heaviness which is countercultural, which is from the outside. A heaviness that when somebody portrays that heaviness, it portrays them as an outsider. What's missing from music nowadays is what is described in this book here. This is what is missing from modern music. The idea of the representation of people who sit outside of society and look in. The Catcher in the Rye, the Lee Harvey Oswald, the Charles Manson, That is what is personified in rock and roll. It is one part Jay Mansfield walking down that road, and one part Charlie Manson sending out his entourage to attack Hollywood, the representation of American culture. Glorious and glitzy from the outside, rotten on the inside. In fact, if we take those two iconic characters, Marilyn Monroe and Charles Manson, we could see that rock and roll, when it reached its absolute apotheosis, as it turned the corner and began to die, it produced its very own Marilyn Manson, the personification of the outsider. By the time Marilyn Manson emerged, that obvious display of what I describe was now commercially viable. The powers that be could see that there was money to be made, and they drained the power out of it. As soon as it was there, it was gone. This happened in the early 90s. Nirvana could be seen as a personification of everything in rock that was outsidery. Kurt Cobain is almost like the ultimate outsider. But by then, Kurt Cobain managed to turn his outsiderness into the most inside money-making scheme going. The record companies came flooding in. If he'd have survived, he would now be one of the biggest establishment figures, being turned to for his opinions on the election, on Trump. Who would Kurt Cobain be voting for? He would have become part of the establishment. Kurt Cobain was the real deal. Perhaps he just knew that and he couldn't take it. The establishment hounded him and he decided to exit the situation. The ultimate choice of the outsider. And still, for me to even say that or hint at it, risks this video being taken down. I feel like an outsider today. This morning I woke up and I switched on Facebook, and I noticed that the Dems, as they're called, the Democrats in America, have decided to call the Republicans weird. That's the new thing. They're weird. They're weird. Oh, don't vote for them. They're weird. And when I read it, I had the pang inside of being at school and feeling weird myself. I felt suddenly back on the outside. My gut reaction was not to side with the in crowd, the conservative middle. I wanted to side with the weirdos. And it seemed that at this moment in time, the weirdos were there with Trump. Almost like the normal people were now the weirdos. I'd spent the night before, looking at interviews with the British people that had gone down to London, ignored by the media, to champion British values. And as they talked into camera over and over again, saying how they were there to support British values, which meant British values for everyone, black or white, rich or poor, with their arms around Indians and Pakistanis and black people. And then I thought about the way they were being portrayed. I thought, these are just normal people, but they've become the outsiders, the weirdos. I felt that I should exert, even at my old age, at least something that was slightly countercultural, so I decided to put a comment on one of these posts. It was a picture of various Republicans with the word, the new weird. So I decided to put a sarcastic comment on. And I wrote, oh, so they've decided to stop calling them Hitler. Now, sooner as I'd done that, Facebook came along and took that comment away. And then notified me that my account had had a ton of restrictions put on it, including the fact that I can now no longer call anybody on Facebook. So I decided to do a post about it. Now, I have quite a following on Facebook, as you could imagine, and my posts do very well. Usually I can get 200 comments, 300 or 400 likes on a post. So I made a little post about this, and I sat there. After half an hour, nobody had seen it. Facebook had decided to take my right away. Was I championing Hitler? No, I was criticising Hitler. I was criticising the whole thing. I was trying to make people realise that when acting like that, as the mob. Because the opposite, the outsider, is the mob. The mob with their pitchforks and torches banding together to hound out whatever evil they think has impinged itself in their society. The normal people. I'm not one of those people. I will side on whoever is the underdog, the true underdog. I'm a contrarian. I think it's the thing about me that has made this YouTube relatively successful. I'm a contrarian. I tried my best to be a contrarian at the beginning of this video. I'm a contrarian. I'll champion the other side. I know when I'm being a contrarian, when it upsets people. I know who to side with to upset people. And if I know it's going to upset people, I will. And the middle-aged people who watch this channel probably recognise something here in its quaint little British way, in its sort of jolly, jolly hockey sticks, let's have a little laugh. A little bit of sort of countercultural rebellion, and it reminds them of what they liked about the music. The fact that it represented something. Now, with modern popular music, it's really difficult to criticise it. And those old people who do, like Rick Beato, that goes steaming in saying it's because of this, the chord progressions aren't good enough, and the playing's not good, there's no real instruments, and it all sounds the same, it's simplistic. We know that there's loads of bands we liked that were simplistic and only had a few chords, and they can play very well. The songs were only 2 minutes long. They're the ones championed by the critics. Surely everyone loves the Ramones. I don't. So we know that that criticism is not correct. I've mulled over that for the past few months. And I think the point of this video is to try and explain that the outsideriness, the aesthetic embodiment of that is what the music we love had and what is now lacking. It's lacking from modern culture. The things that were countercultural in the 1960s have become the cliche of today. This is why we have drag queens and gay people dancing around reenacting the Last Supper. The reason why the powers that be fund that is because they know no one will really complain. It won't shock anybody. It is just the shallow, meaningless, generic repetition of something that was incredibly countercultural 60 years ago. We know exactly where the taboos lie now. And it's interesting to think that all the artists that are celebrated now did push those taboos. They were shut up and they were told to keep quiet. They were stuck in prison sometimes. They were hounded, arrested. It's the people who are like that now. Those are the ones who are countercultural. And if in your old age you now find their behaviour abhorrent, maybe it's because that treadmill you have been on has put you fully to sleep. And maybe it's time for us all to wake up a little bit. Come on, oldies. We know about this countercultural stuff, don't we? Maybe our job isn't maybe our job isn't to be curmudgeons and sit there complaining about everything. Maybe our job is just to become what old people always have been. The best old people are the ones who are a little bit of a stick in the mud, right, in culture. Because for millennia, the old people were seen as the wise people, weren't they? And they would say what they thought. They had nothing to lose often. So they would just say the truth. They had the experience to have lived their life, and they saw that. But our generation doesn't come from that. Our generation was a generation that had to question what the olds were saying. And in that, it diminished what old people did. It was the music and the art and the voice of young people. But now all those young people, those countercultural young people who dance naked at Woodstock or stuck, safety pins through their nose in London in the mid-70s, are now going to the doctors to get their prostates checked. They're dying. That curtain, the cultural curtain, has shut. I'm a little bit younger than that. I sort of came to fruition in the 80s, but my interest was in 70s music. I'm aware that my audience is even older than I am. I have a bit of a postmodernism, the whiff of sort of a Brechterian postmodernist approach, which is a counter to sort of the Nietzschean ideal of the Led Zeppelins and Jimi Hendrixes and the Doors. I've got a little bit of the postmodernism that you saw with bands like Devo, or Frankie Goes to Hollywood. I have a little bit of that here as well. And I'm aware of that. What am I trying to say here? What I'm saying is that if you're watching this, wake up. Have this as a shock. Look at your own opinions. Is this just habit? Is this just the opinion of someone whose brain has actually switched off? Or is there a way of self-awakening, of self-remembering? Is there still that little bit of spirit? If you are an outsider and you're still here, because if you're not an outsider, everything I just said would just sound like nonsense. But if this sort of made sense to you, walk towards that and see what happens. If you like this video, can you please put a like on it? Right? Because what I've just done is not great for my algorithm at all. And so here at the end, after being the countercultural rebel and just staring you down at the beginning of the video and warding off anybody at the beginning of the video that dared to come here, and click on this. Oh, Andy's not playing the game. And here I am at the end going, please stick a like on the video, please. Can you stick one on now? It will help me out. And if you could just press the button for subscribing, that would help me out as well. And what would really out would becoming a patron. You can become a free patron if you want to have a look around. Or you can pay a little bit of money and you get access to the Patreon chat and a whole bunch of other brilliant things that will make your life better. And I promise I'm going to make your life better. I am not going to make your life better. Don't believe anybody who tells you that. Or you can help me by giving me some money by dropping a little tip in the PayPal tip jar. You can also send me a message on there. I won't answer it because I am inundated by messages left, right and centre. And that is a problem I have. I'm looking at my laptop, and whilst I've been doing this, there's probably about 30 messages now that have just popped up. I'll have to try and keep on top of them and give each one a quick squint and move on to the next. Oh, what it is to be a successful YouTuber. What must it be like for the likes of Andy Neely and Rick Beato's? It must be hell on earth. Hell on earth. With this point, you have to imagine a bubble now. And in that bubble is me in a recording studio like Rick Beato's. And I'm sat down, and my people that I now pay to do the YouTube videos, they're dropping grapes and bits of soft cheese into my mouth as I swing in a hammock in my huge garden. That's what you have to imagine. Oh, what a lovely thing.